My mom kicked me out at 18. A decade later I was paying her rent. I was 18 years old when my mother told me to leave. I remember the exact date. October 15, 2014. I remember what I was wearing. A gray hoodie with a hole in the left pocket, jeans that were already too worn, and sneakers that had seen better days. I remember the smell of the apartment. That mixture of stale coffee and cigarette smoke that had become the backdrop of my entire childhood. Most of all, I remember the look on her face when she said those words, and the realization that the person who gave me life had decided I was no longer worth keeping. My name is Marcus, and this is the story of how being abandoned became the greatest gift I never asked for. My mother, Catherine, was not a bad person. That's important for me to say up front because I spent years thinking she was a monster. I spent years constructing narratives in my head where she was cruel and calculated, where she'd planned to throw me out, where there was some clarity to her decision that made sense. It was easier to hate a monster than to process the reality. My mother was simply broken and I was collateral damage. She'd gotten pregnant with me at 22, by a man who disappeared the moment she told him the news. His name was Robert and I've never met him. My mother has mentioned him perhaps 3 times in my life, always with a bitterness in her voice that suggested she'd made peace with his absence in the way people make peace with natural disasters, by accepting that some things are simply beyond your control. Growing up with Catherine was like living with someone who was perpetually drowning. She worked retail jobs, fast food positions, anything that would pay the bills. But no matter how hard she worked, we were always behind. Always struggling. Always one unexpected expense away from complete collapse. I watched her age in real time, her hair graying prematurely, her shoulders curved inward from the weight of constant stress, her smile becoming something she had to manufacture rather than something that came naturally. By the time I was 15, she'd started drinking more. Not in the spectacular way that gets people arrested or makes the news. More in the quiet, systematic way that slowly erases someone. A wine bottle on the counter after work. 2 glasses instead of 1. Then 3. Then a habit that became routine, and routine became necessity. I don't think she was trying to escape me. I think she was trying to escape the reality that she'd created a human being and didn't have the resources, emotional, financial, or otherwise, to care for him properly. I think the weight of that realization, combined with the daily grind of survival, simply broke something fundamental inside her. By 17, I was taking care of myself in most ways that mattered. I cooked my own meals because my mother often forgot to eat, let alone prepare food for both of us. I did laundry because clean clothes became scarce. I managed the household finances as best I could because I understood, even as a teenager, that our landlord wasn't going to accept my mom is stressed as payment. I worked part-time at a grocery store on weekends, ostensibly to have spending money, but really to contribute to the household expenses. I was already an adult. I just hadn't been officially kicked out yet. The night it happened, my mother had been drinking more than usual. I came home from my shift at the grocery store around 9 p.m., tired and wanting nothing more than to collapse into bed. The apartment was dark except for the light from the television, and I found her on the couch, a glass of wine balanced precariously on the armrest, tears streaming down her face. I asked her what was wrong. I've replayed that question 1,000 times, wondering if there was a different way to ask it, a gentler way, a way that might have changed the trajectory of everything that followed. But I don't think it would have mattered. I think that night was inevitable. I think my mother had been building toward it for years, and the only question was when it would finally explode. She didn't answer my question directly. Instead, she started talking about her life. About the dreams she'd had before I was born. About the person she thought she'd become. About the fact that at 40 she was working retail, living in a shitty apartment, with nothing to show for her existence except a teenage son who she'd failed to raise properly. Her words weren't directed at me, but they landed like bullets. I stood there in the darkness of that apartment, listening to my mother systematically dismantle any illusion I had that I was wanted. She talked about how different her life would have been if she hadn't gotten pregnant. She talked about how unfair it was that she'd sacrificed everything and received nothing in return. She talked about how I was old enough now and how maybe it was time for me to figure out how to take care of myself. I told her she didn't mean it. I told her she was drunk and that we could talk about this in the morning. I told her that I loved her and that we would figure it out together. I said all the things that 18-year-old says when the ground beneath him is collapsing. She told me to pack a bag. I remember standing there not moving, waiting for her to recant, to take it back, to say she was sorry and didn't mean any of it. But my mother had made a decision, and in that moment, the alcohol had finally given her the courage to follow through on something she'd been contemplating for months. She stood up from the couch, steadied herself against the armrest and pointed toward my bedroom. "Pack a bag," she repeated. "You're 18. You're an adult. Figure it out." And then she turned back to the television like I'd already ceased to exist. I moved like someone in a dream. I pulled out my old backpack from the closet and started throwing things into it. Clothes. My wallet. A photo album that my grandmother had made for me before she died. My laptop. My phone charger. I worked methodically, not thinking too hard about what I was doing because thinking about it would have meant acknowledging that my mother was really throwing me out. That the person who was supposed to love me unconditionally had decided that her own comfort was more important than my safety. I took about 45 minutes to pack. She didn't come check on me. She didn't come to say goodbye or that she was sorry or that she'd made a mistake. She stayed on that couch, and I could hear the occasional clink of her glass against the armrest as she reached for more wine. When I emerged from my room with my backpack, she was asleep. I stood there for a moment looking at her. This woman who had given me life and then decided she didn't want that responsibility anymore. I wanted to feel angry. I wanted to feel hatred. What I actually felt was a vast, empty sadness. I felt like an orphan even though my mother was sleeping 15 feet away from me. I left the apartment at around midnight on October 15, 2014. I took the backpack, my keys, and whatever change was in my pockets. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye to the sleeping figure on the couch. I simply walked out the door, closed it quietly behind me, and stepped into a world that suddenly didn't include a home. The October night in Phoenix was warm, but not warm enough to sleep outside without some kind of shelter. I walked the streets for hours, my backpack heavy on my shoulders, my mind numb with shock. I kept expecting to wake up. I kept expecting this to be a bad dream that would evaporate in the morning light. It wasn't. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself at a 24-hour diner near the highway. I had about $12 in my pocket. I ordered coffee to justify my presence and sat in a booth by the window, watching the occasional car pass by, each one carrying someone to somewhere, to someone, to a home that actually wanted them. That's when the reality truly hit me. I was homeless. I was 18 years old and I had no home, no family willing to take me in, and no plan for what came next. I was a legal adult with absolutely nowhere to go and no one who cared whether I lived or died. Sitting in that diner booth, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, I made a decision. I decided that my mother's rejection would not define my future. I decided that being abandoned at 18 would not become my excuse for failure. I decided that I would build something. A life, a home, a sense of belonging, that no one could ever take away from me again. I didn't know how I was going to do it. I didn't have a plan or a roadmap. What I had was anger, pain, and a desperate need to prove that I was worth something, even if my own mother didn't think so. That need became my compass for the next decade. The first night I spent outdoors was in my car. Except I didn't have a car. So technically, the first night I spent homeless was in the parking lot of a Walmart, sitting in the back of a delivery truck that was open, waiting for dawn to come so I could slip away before anyone noticed I'd been there. I was 18 years old and I'd already started learning the geography of survival. The weeks that followed that October night were a blur of desperation and small victories. I couldn't stay with friends. Most of my classmates came from families that were barely holding their own, and no one's parents wanted to take in a teenager who'd been kicked out. I couldn't go to a shelter because I was terrified and because part of me still believed that my situation was temporary, that my mother would call and ask me to come home, that this was all some horrible mistake. That call never came. I got a job within a week. It wasn't hard. I was already working part-time at the grocery store, and I simply asked if I could increase my hours. The manager, a man named Derek who was in his 50s and had a rough exterior but a surprisingly kind heart, asked me why I needed more hours. I almost lied. I almost made up some excuse about saving for college or wanting extra spending money. Instead, I told him the truth. "I'm homeless," I said. Just like that. No preamble, no shame, just a statement of fact. Derek stared at me for a long moment. Then he did something I didn't expect. He hired me for the night shift, which paid 50 cents more per hour, and he let me shower in the employee bathroom before my shifts. He never made a big deal out of it. He never acted like he was doing me some massive favor. He simply treated me like a human being who needed help, and he helped without making me feel like I owed him my gratitude forever. Those first few months I worked the night shift at the grocery store, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and then I would spend the day figuring out where to sleep and how to stay clean. I learned which parks had public bathrooms that were unlocked during certain hours. I learned which 24-hour gyms had trial memberships that lasted a week and didn't require a credit card. I learned which libraries opened early and would let you sit there without buying anything, and which ones had showers in their locker rooms. I learned that survival isn't about one big solution. It's about 1,000 small solutions strung together like beads on a string. By November, I'd saved enough from my paychecks to pay for a week at a cheap motel. It was the kind of place where you didn't ask questions about the stains on the walls or the strange sounds coming from the adjacent rooms. But it had a shower and a bed, and for 7 days I had an address. It was the first time since leaving my mother's apartment that I felt something like stability. That motel became my goal. Every paycheck I would save enough to stay there for a week. I would work my shifts, go to the motel, shower, sleep in a real bed, and then when the week was up I'd go back to the streets or the car lot or the park, whatever I could manage that particular night. It was exhausting. It was soul-crushing. It was also the beginning of my transformation. In December I realized that I had a bigger problem than just finding a place to sleep. I had no address, which meant I couldn't open a bank account properly. I couldn't get a library card. I couldn't apply for better jobs that required references or a stable living situation. I was trapped in a cycle where the only jobs available to me were the ones that paid cash under the table or the ones that didn't ask too many questions. That's when I met Robert. Not my biological father, but a man who would become far more important to my survival than Robert Sr. ever could have been. I met Robert at the gym where I was using a trial membership. He was a personal trainer, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of presence that made people notice him without him trying. He noticed me because I was the guy who came in at 5 in the morning, did a quick workout and then camped out in the locker room for as long as I could without being obvious about it. One morning he approached me and asked if I needed a job. I was immediately defensive. I thought he was going to tell me I couldn't be there anymore, that I was making other members uncomfortable, that I needed to leave. Instead he was offering me work. Robert owned a small personal training studio, and he needed someone to help with maintenance, cleaning and general operations. It didn't pay much, $12 an hour, but it was a legitimate job. It was the kind of job where I could put his address as my contact information, where I could have a reference, where I could start to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. I took it immediately. Working at Robert's studio changed everything. Suddenly I wasn't just surviving, I was beginning to build something. I worked my shifts at the grocery store at night and my shifts at Robert's studio during the day. I was sleeping maybe 4 hours a night, but I was working and I was earning money, and I was beginning to form relationships with people who knew my situation and didn't judge me for it. Robert became my mentor without ever formally taking on that role. He would leave me food in the office. Sandwiches, fruit, coffee. He never made a big deal out of it. It was just there like he knew I needed it. He taught me about the fitness industry, about business operations, about the value of showing up consistently and doing your work without complaining. But more importantly, Robert taught me that there were people in the world who were willing to help just because they could. He never asked for anything in return. He never made me feel indebted. He simply saw a kid who was struggling and decided to be the kind of person who helped kids who were struggling. By the spring of 2015, 6 months after being kicked out of my mother's apartment, I had saved enough money for first month's rent and a security deposit on a studio apartment in a not great neighborhood of Phoenix. It wasn't much. It was about 350 square feet with a kitchenette that barely functioned and a bathroom so small you could touch both walls if you stretched your arms out. But it was mine. I had a lease with my name on it. I had an address. I had a home. I remember walking into that apartment for the first time and just sitting on the floor, crying. Not sad tears. Relief tears. Tears of someone who had climbed out of a hole and finally found solid ground. That studio apartment became my headquarters. It became the place where I could breathe. It became the place where I could stop just surviving and start actually planning for a future. I continued working both jobs through 2015 and into 2016. I lived frugally, not because I was forced to anymore, but because I'd internalized the lesson of scarcity. I spent money on rent, on food, on basic necessities. Everything else felt like luxury that I didn't deserve. I was saving money aggressively, with a clarity of purpose that most people don't develop until much later in life, if they ever develop it at all. By 2016, I had enough saved to make a real decision about my future. I could continue working these 2 jobs indefinitely, making just enough to get by. Or I could take a risk. I chose to take the risk. I enrolled in community college, taking classes in business and finance. I worked out a schedule where I could attend classes during the day and still work my evening shift at the grocery store. Robert was supportive, adjusting my schedule at the studio to accommodate my classes. Derek at the grocery store didn't care as long as I was reliable, which I was. College was different from high school. In high school I'd been invisible, the kid whose mother was poor and whose family situation was unstable. In community college I was one of hundreds of students trying to build a better life. Some of them were older, coming back to school after working for years. Some were immigrants learning in a second language. Some were parents trying to balance education with childcare. No one judged anyone else's circumstances because everyone was there for the same reason: to escape their current situation and create something better. I thrived in that environment. I was no longer competing for approval from people who'd already decided I didn't matter. I was simply showing up, doing the work, and proving to myself that I had value. My GPA was nearly perfect. My professors noticed me. I started to develop a sense of confidence that I'd never had before. By 2017 I was working 3 jobs: the grocery store at night, Robert's studio part-time, and an internship at a financial services company that paid nothing but gave me actual experience in the industry I wanted to enter. I was taking a full course load at community college. I was sleeping maybe 5 hours a night. I was living on coffee and determination and the fierce knowledge that I would never, ever go back to being homeless. That fear became my fuel. Every time I felt tired, every time I wanted to quit, every time the weight of juggling multiple jobs and full-time school felt like too much, I would remember the night I sat in that diner booth nursing a cold cup of coffee. I would remember the Walmart parking lot. I would remember the motel with the suspicious stains. I would remember the feeling of not knowing where I was going to sleep. And I would push myself harder. By the time I was 22, I had completed my associate degree and transferred to Arizona State University to pursue a bachelor's degree in finance. I had moved out of the studio apartment into a slightly better one-bedroom that was in a safer neighborhood. I had left the grocery store job and the studio job and was working in an entry-level position at a financial services company, making a real salary with benefits. I was still working long hours. I was still living frugally. I was still driven by the memory of abandonment and the fear of returning to it. But I was no longer just surviving. I was building. Looking back at those years, from 18 to 22, I can see them as the foundation for everything that came after. Every difficult shift, every night I chose to go to class instead of going to sleep, every time I pushed myself when I was exhausted, those weren't just moments of hardship. They were moments of transformation. They were the forge in which my character was created. My mother didn't know any of this was happening. She didn't call. She didn't reach out. As far as I knew, she hadn't thought about me at all. And somewhere along the way that stopped hurting. It stopped mattering. Because I'd realized that I was the only person I could actually count on. I was the only person who was going to save me. That realization, more than any paycheck, more than any achievement, was the most valuable thing I gained from those years of survival. Graduating from Arizona State University in 2019 was surreal. I walked across that stage in May, shook the dean's hand and received my diploma in finance while my classmates cheered and their families took photographs. I looked out into the audience and realized that I was completely alone. No mother cheering from the stands. No father beaming with pride. No siblings or aunts or uncles or anyone who was related to me by blood. The people who should have been there to celebrate one of the most significant moments of my life had simply never existed in any meaningful way. So I celebrated alone. I bought myself a nice dinner at a restaurant I couldn't quite afford, and I sat at a table for one, and I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I'd accomplished. I'd gone from homeless to college graduate in 5 years. I'd done it without family support, without safety net, without anyone believing in me except myself and a handful of mentors who decided that kindness mattered more than obligation. That moment, sitting alone in that restaurant eating steak I'd saved for, wearing a shirt I'd ironed myself, became the moment I realized that I didn't need anyone to validate my success. I was my own validation. I was my own proof. My career in finance accelerated rapidly after graduation. The financial services company I'd been working for, part-time during school, full-time after graduation, offered me a promotion to junior analyst. It came with a 30% salary increase, which at the time felt like an obscene amount of money. I was making $60,000 a year. To someone who'd been living paycheck to paycheck, sleeping in cars and motels, this felt like wealth beyond measure. I moved into a better apartment, still modest, still in a working-class neighborhood, but with actual square footage and natural light. I bought a used Honda Civic that ran reliably. I opened a savings account that was actually growing month to month. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was actually living. But I didn't stop pushing. I was promoted to senior analyst in 2020, and by 2021, I'd been recruited by a larger firm, Goldman Sachs's Phoenix office, where I joined their analyst program. The salary jumped to $90,000. The work was more demanding. The hours were longer. But the trajectory was clear. I was climbing. My mentality during those years was simple. If I wasn't moving forward, I was moving backward. There was no neutral. There was no rest. Rest was for people who had safety nets. Rest was for people who could afford to fail. I couldn't afford either of those luxuries. I worked 80-hour weeks. I studied for my Series 7 and Series 65 licenses. I took on projects that no one else wanted to touch because I knew that visibility led to opportunity. I volunteered for roles that required weekend work and travel because I understood that sacrifice was the currency of advancement. By 2023, I was promoted to vice president of the firm's investment analysis division. I was 26 years old. My salary had climbed to $220,000 per year, plus bonus. For the first time in my life, I had real money. Not just enough to survive, but actual wealth. I remember the day I got that promotion like it was yesterday. My boss, A woman named Sandra, who had become something of a mentor to me, called me into her office and told me that they were creating a new position specifically for me. Vice President. Management track. She saw potential in me that went beyond just the numbers. She believed I could lead people. I remember trying to maintain professional composure while internally I was screaming. I remember walking back to my desk and sitting down and just staring at my computer screen, unable to focus, overwhelmed by the reality that I had actually made it. I had actually succeeded. That evening I sat in my apartment, a nice 2-bedroom in a good neighborhood that I'd recently purchased, and I called Robert. He was the first person I told. I made vice president, I said. And then I started crying. Just completely lost it. All the years of pushing, all the years of survival, all the years of proving something to someone, and it had culminated in this moment where I was officially successful. Robert, in his typical fashion, simply said, "I knew you would. You've always had what it takes." No big celebration. No dramatic reaction. Just acknowledgement that this was always inevitable, from the moment I'd first walked into his gym at 5 in the morning with nowhere else to go. By 2024 I had become someone I never expected to be. I was wealthy. I had investments beyond my salary, real estate holdings, a diversified stock portfolio, business partnerships. I was making close to $500,000 per year when you factored in bonuses. I had built the kind of financial security that most people only dream about. But more than the money, I had built power. I had built authority. I had built the kind of presence in a room where people listened when I spoke. I had become the kind of person that others looked up to, aspired to be like, wanted to know. I used that power strategically. I started mentoring young analysts who came from difficult backgrounds. I funded a scholarship for homeless youth pursuing education. I became involved in business associations and professional networks. I built my reputation not just as someone who was good at his job, but as someone who understood struggle and who used his success to help lift others up. This was intentional. This was strategic. Every move I made was calculated to build the kind of legacy that said, I came from nothing and I became something. And if I can do it, so can you. During these years, from 2019 to 2024, I had exactly zero contact with my mother. I didn't see her. I didn't hear from her. As far as I knew, she was still living in that same apartment in Phoenix, probably still working retail, probably still drinking, probably still wondering what had happened to the son she'd kicked out a decade earlier. I won't lie and say I didn't think about her. I did. But my thoughts about her were complicated. They weren't the simple hatred or resentment that characterized my feelings in those first years after she'd thrown me out. They were more complicated than that. I thought about her with a kind of cold distance, the way you might think about a historical figure rather than someone who shared your blood. Sometimes, in moments of weakness, I would wonder what would happen if I ran into her. Would she recognize me? Would she feel any guilt about what she'd done? Would she try to explain herself, to make amends, to rebuild something that had been fundamentally broken? And the answer I always came back to was, it didn't matter. Whatever she might say or do, it couldn't change the fact that she had abandoned me at 18 years old. It couldn't change the fact that I'd had to build myself from nothing. It couldn't change the fact that I'd survived without her, and that survival had made me stronger and more resilient and more capable than I probably would have been if I'd had a normal childhood. In some twisted way, her abandonment had been a gift. It had forced me to develop the kind of determination that most people never develop. It had taught me that I could survive anything. It had given me the hunger that had propelled me to the top of my profession. I had transformed her cruelty into my fuel, and that fuel had taken me further than I ever could have imagined. By 2024, when I was 28 years old, I had achieved everything that the 18-year-old kid sitting in that diner booth had dreamed of. I had security. I had respect. I had power. I had proven that I was worth something, that my life mattered, that my success was real and earned and undeniable. The irony, and it was a bitter-sweet irony, was that the person I'd originally been trying to prove myself to had probably forgotten about me entirely. My mother didn't know about my success. She didn't know about my positions, my salary, my investments, my influence. She probably didn't think about me at all. But I knew. And that knowledge was enough. What I didn't know, what none of us can ever fully predict, was that life had one more twist waiting for me. One more moment that would completely upend everything I thought I'd resolved, everything I thought I'd moved past, everything I thought I'd successfully compartmentalized into the category of my past that no longer defines me. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, it would force me to finally answer the question I'd been avoiding for a decade. What would I do if my mother came back? What would I do if the person who'd abandoned me suddenly needed me more than she'd ever needed anything in her life? At 28 years old, sitting in my corner office in downtown Phoenix, looking out at the city below, I thought I had the answer. I thought I knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of and what I would and wouldn't do. I was about to learn that I'd been wrong about almost everything. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in June of 2024. I was in my office on the 34th floor of a building in downtown Phoenix, reviewing quarterly reports, when my assistant knocked on the door and told me there was someone on the line asking for me. She said the person hadn't given a name and that she sounded distressed. I almost didn't take the call. I don't take calls from unknown numbers. That's what voicemail is for. But something made me pick up. Some instinct, some frequency that my body recognized even before my mind did. "Hello," I said. There was a long silence on the other end. And then I heard breathing. Shallow, nervous breathing that I recognized on some level that I didn't want to recognize. "Marcus." A woman's voice. Tentative. Older. Worn down by something I couldn't quite identify through the phone line. It's your mother." I didn't speak. I couldn't speak. It had been 10 years since I'd heard that voice. 10 years since she'd told me to leave, since she'd pointed toward my bedroom and told me to pack a bag, since she'd decided I was no longer worth keeping. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me," she continued. "I know I have no right to call you. But I need help. And you're the only person I could think of." I should have hung up. Every rational part of my brain told me to hang up, to block her number, to pretend this conversation had never happened. The 18-year-old Marcus who had been sitting in that diner booth nursing cold coffee would have hung up. The Marcus who had been sleeping in cars and motels and parks would have hung up. The Marcus who had spent 10 years clawing his way out of nothing would have hung up. But the Marcus sitting in that corner office, the Marcus who had become successful and powerful and accomplished, was different. And I'm still not entirely sure if that difference was evolution or corrosion. "What do you need?" I asked. My mother explained her situation through a voice that wavered between hope and shame. She'd lost her job 3 months earlier. The retail company she'd worked for had closed stores and she'd been let go without severance. She'd been unable to find another job. Her savings had run out. She'd maxed out her credit cards trying to keep up with rent and bills. The apartment where I'd grown up, the apartment she'd kicked me out of, was facing eviction. She had 30 days to come up with back rent or she would be homeless. She was 54 years old and she was about to be homeless. The irony was so complete, so perfectly circular that I almost laughed. My mother, the woman who had abandoned me when I was 18, who had told me to figure it out on my own, who had chosen her own comfort over my safety, was now facing the exact nightmare that I had faced. She was facing the reality of not knowing where she was going to sleep, of having nowhere to go, of being completely alone. And she was calling me because she thought I was her solution. "How much do you need?" I asked. $12,000, she said. 3 months of back rent plus the deposit. If I can just catch up, I can get another job and I can get back on my feet. I just need help getting through this rough patch. $12,000. It was a significant amount of money to most people. To me, it was less than 3 weeks of salary. It was nothing. It was the kind of money I spent on a nice vacation without thinking about it. I could solve her problem with a single wire transfer. "I'll call you back," I told her. I hung up the phone and sat there in my office looking out at the city below. The afternoon sun was hitting the buildings at that angle that made everything look golden, temporary, like it was all going to burn away at any moment. I thought about that night when she told me to leave. I thought about the years that followed, the struggle, the pain, the constant uncertainty. I thought about sleeping in my car. I thought about the shower at the gym. I thought about the Walmart parking lot and the motel with the suspicious stains. I thought about working 70-hour weeks while going to school full-time. I thought about the hunger, the exhaustion, the loneliness. I thought about the fact that she'd never apologized. She'd never reached out. She'd never asked if I was okay or where I was or if I needed help. She'd simply cut me out of her life and moved on. And now she was calling because she needed money. I called Robert. He'd retired a few years earlier and was living a quieter life, but we still talked regularly. He was the closest thing I had to family, the closest thing I had to someone who understood my journey. "I need your advice," I told him, and I explained the situation. Robert listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to tell her no," I said. "I want to tell her that she made her bed and now she has to lie in it. I want to tell her that she abandoned me when I was 18 and I survived and she can figure out how to survive too. I want to make her feel the way I felt. Alone, scared, completely without options." "Okay," Robert said. "And what does that accomplish?" "It makes us even," I said. "It balances the cosmic scales. It proves that I've won and she's lost." "Does it though?" Robert asked. "Or does it just mean you've both lost?" I didn't have an answer to that. "Let me ask you something else," Robert continued. "The person you've become, the successful guy, the powerful guy, the guy who helps young people who come from difficult backgrounds, is that person the kind of person who would tell his mother to figure it out on her own?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to say that my mother didn't deserve my help, that she'd forfeited the right to my compassion when she'd kicked me out. I wanted to construct a moral argument that justified my cruelty. But I couldn't. Because Robert was right. The person I'd spent so much time becoming, the mentor, the helper, the guy who understood struggle, that person wouldn't leave his mother homeless. Even if that mother had left him homeless. Even if she'd never apologized. Even if she'd never reached out. That person would help. I'm scared, I admitted. Of what? Robert asked. That if I help her, I'm betraying the part of me that had to be hard to survive. That if I forgive her, I'm saying that what she did was okay. That if I give her money, I'm letting her off the hook, and she never has to take responsibility for how she treated me. Maybe, Robert said. Or maybe helping someone in crisis doesn't mean you're forgiving what they did in the past. Maybe those can be two separate things. I got off the phone with Robert and sat in my office for another hour just thinking. I thought about the 10-year journey from homeless to vice president. I thought about every person who'd helped me along the way. Derek at the grocery store, Robert at the gym, Sandra at Goldman Sachs. All the mentors and teachers and kind strangers who'd decided that one person's struggle was worth their time and attention. I thought about the irony of my mother calling me now, in the exact moment when I had the power to help her. I thought about the cosmic joke of it, that she'd tried to make me irrelevant, and instead she'd created the conditions for me to become indispensable. And I thought about what it meant to win. Real winning. Not the kind where you prove someone wrong. Not the kind where you make them suffer the way you suffered. But the kind where you transcend your own pain and become someone better than your circumstances required you to become. I called my mother back. I'll help you, I said. But I need to understand something first. I need you to acknowledge what you did. I need you to say that you were wrong to throw me out. I need you to say that you're sorry. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I'm sorry, she said finally. Her voice was breaking. I'm so sorry, Marcus. I've been sorry for 10 years. I've been sorry every single day since that night. Those words, simple as they were, unlocked something inside me that had been locked for a decade. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that she had hurt me, that she knew she had hurt me, and that she wished she hadn't. I set up a wire transfer for $12,000 that afternoon. I didn't do it publicly. I didn't do it expecting gratitude or recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because the person I'd become was the kind of person who did the right thing, even when that person was the mother who'd abandoned me. Over the next few months, I became more involved in my mother's life. Not out of obligation but out of genuine care that surprised me with its authenticity. I helped her find a job. I connected her with a therapist to deal with the addiction and depression that had driven her to drink, that had driven her to abandon me. I helped her rebuild her life in a way that didn't depend entirely on me, but that had my support as a foundation. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I felt resentful. There were moments when I wanted to throw her abandonment back in her face. There were moments when I questioned whether I was being foolish, whether I was allowing myself to be taken advantage of. But I continued anyway. By the end of 2024, my mother had been sober for 6 months. She was working a stable job. She'd moved into a small apartment that she could afford on her own salary. She was rebuilding her life not with my money but with my support. More than that, we were building a relationship. Not the one we should have had. Not the one where a mother unconditionally loves her son from childhood. But a real one, based on honesty and accountability and the understanding that people can hurt each other and still choose to love each other. One evening we were sitting in my apartment, the nice 2-bedroom in the good neighborhood that she'd never seen before, and she turned to me and said something I never expected to hear. I'm proud of you, she said. I know I have no right to be after everything. But I am. I'm so proud of who you've become. And I realized something in that moment. I realized that I'd been building my entire success as a response to her. As a way to prove her wrong. As a way to show her what she'd lost by abandoning me. But true success, I understood then, wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about becoming someone you could respect. It was about building something so real, so genuine, so rooted in your own values and your own determination, that it didn't matter whether anyone else believed in you. Because you believed in yourself. The money I'd given my mother, the $12,000, wasn't about redemption. It wasn't about making up for the years she'd abandoned me. It wasn't about balancing cosmic scales or proving that I'd won. It was about choosing to be the kind of person who helps, even when that person didn't deserve to be helped. It was about recognizing that my success had given me power, and power was only meaningful if you used it with wisdom and compassion. It was about understanding that the greatest victory isn't in making someone feel your pain. It's in rising above your pain and becoming someone capable of helping others despite it. When I was 18, sitting in that diner booth with a cold cup of coffee and nowhere to go, I thought that success would look like proving my mother wrong. I thought that the moment she realized how successful I'd become would be the moment I'd finally feel whole. But wholeness didn't come from her recognition. It came from within me. It came from the knowledge that I had survived, that I had built something real, and that I was using that something to make the world slightly better for people who were struggling the way I had struggled. Standing in my apartment looking at my mother, this broken, flawed human woman who had hurt me deeply and who I was now helping to heal, I finally understood what the past 10 years had really been about. They hadn't been about proving her wrong. They'd been about proving me right. Proving that I was worth something. Proving that my life mattered. Proving that I was capable of more than just surviving. I was capable of thriving. And more than that, I was capable of transforming pain into purpose, abandonment into empathy, and revenge into redemption. That was the real victory. That was what it meant to win.